if one is reading Plato's dialogues to see Socrates basically at the peak of intellectual practice, then it makes sense that the people we now call the Sophists are really his confrères.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning. I'm a classicist at Brown University, and for the past week or so, I've been thinking about the Sophists more than usual, since for my graduate seminar, Xenophon and Friends, we just read Plato's Apology of Socrates alongside Gorgias' Defense of Palamedes. And that text is one that's going to come up briefly in this episode. Sophist is one of those terms where you maybe think you know what it means, but then the more you look into it, the more complicated and difficult it gets to pin down. I think we tend to think of the Sophists as a group of teachers who milled around Athens, charging wealthy families to educate their sons in rhetoric and wisdom, kind of like private tutors or professors for hire. We also tend to buy Plato's line that Socrates wasn't one of them, despite how Aristophanes had depicted Socrates in his comedy The Clouds. After all, Socrates didn't charge for his conversations. But in classical Athens, the word sophist had all sorts of meanings. Sometimes it referred to poets, sometimes to musicians, sometimes just to intellectuals in general. And the people we now call the Sophists, figures like Protagoras and Prodicus and Gorgias, weren't necessarily even called that in their own time. The category as we know it today was largely shaped with prejudice by later thinkers and authors, especially Plato, who often portrayed Sophists in a negative light, precisely to contrast them with his beloved teacher, Socrates. But the concept itself is still valuable. The Sophists represent a major aspect of that amazing burst of intellectual creativity that took place in 5th century Athens. They asked radical questions about the relationship between culture and nature, or nomos and physis, about whether virtue could be taught, about the relationship between language and reality. They were developing new ways of arguing and teaching. They were bringing philosophical thinking into conversation with politics, rhetoric, and education. And all this against the background of the Peloponnesian War. My guests for this episode, Josh Billings and Christopher Moore, are the editors of the recently published Cambridge Companion to the Sophists, which is really a major contribution not just to our understanding of the Sophists themselves, and whatever that means or whoever they were, but of Greek intellectual history. The Sophists have long been viewed primarily through the hostile lens of Plato, who portrayed them as mercenary teachers of rhetoric, teachers of how to make the worse argument seem the better, and all that sort of thing. But Josh and Christopher's volume really shows how that characterization dramatically oversimplifies what was actually a diverse and influential group of thinkers who helped shape Greek philosophical, political, and cultural discourses. As you'll be hearing in this episode, the volume also shows how what Josh and Christopher call the very problem of the Sophists, so that's the difficulty in defining exactly who they were and what unified them, if anything, is itself historically illuminating, and also revealing of the complex intellectual ferment that characterized 5th century Athens. Josh Billings is professor of classics and comparative literature at Princeton University. His research centers on ancient Greek literature and philosophy, and modern intellectual history, with a particular concentration on tragedy. He is the author of Genealogy of the Tragic, Greek Tragedy and German Philosophy, so that's Princeton 2014, and also The Philosophical Stage, Drama and Dialectic in Classical Athens, Princeton 2021. Christopher Moore is a professor of philosophy in classics at Penn State University. He has published 3 monographs focusing on topics in classical philosophy, principally on the form taken by early debates about eventually canonical philosophical topics, for example, self-knowledge, virtue, philosophy itself. He is currently completing a book on intellectual culture in the 5th century BCE. Just a quick note that, as ever, I put a few references in the show notes. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Josh Billings and Christopher Moore. The next voice you'll be hearing is Josh's.
So from my perspective, the project began when I was beginning to think about 5th century intellectual history and drama. And I encountered, among other people, reading in 5th century philosophy, Christopher's work. But what I could not find, at least in a way that satisfied me, was an up-to-date view of the major figures in late 5th century intellectual history, the Sophists. And eventually, on meeting Christopher and having a series of conversations with him, I think we came to the view that the Sophists were in need of new research. There was a lot of reconsideration that had been happening of them sort of individually, and that a more synthetic view of the Sophists, which took them seriously as contributors to 5th century intellectual history, but also took really seriously the historiographical challenges in approaching them. We felt that a new approach to the Sophists along those lines was going to be important.
Yeah, and part of the issue was that it seemed to us a lot of the recent studies had been starting a little too far into the conceptualization. And so there was often reclaiming the Sophists or reinforcing some particular philosophical redemption of the Sophists. But these moves seemed to be assuming, in a sense, what they're trying to argue for. They were assuming a certain group of people doing a certain set of activities. And to some extent, that might have been okay. But I mean, Josh and I were a little bit doubtful, actually, about a number of the generalizations on which claims were being made, either that the Sophists were relativists, which, I mean, maybe that's the case with Gorgias and Protagoras. Maybe it's not even the case about them, that they were teachers. Maybe that holds for Thrasymachus or whatever, but not obviously the case for all of them. And so we were interested in that sort of reevaluation, but as Josh was saying about the historiographical point, we realized that we had to go back quite a bit earlier to say, who are we even talking about? What do we even know about the group of people we might want to talk about, and build up from there? I think the big breakthrough for us was we're meeting sort of halfway. We're meeting in Midtown Scholar in Harrisburg, PA, and Josh said, yeah, so I mean, we're talking about the chapters that we need, and Josh said, but I don't think we should do chapters on the individual Sophists. And it's like, that's right. That was exactly right. Let's do it thematically. And then as we started listing themes, we had a list of dozens of items. And at that point, I think the project really crystallized.
To the historiographical point, you mentioned that a lot of studies depart from a certain set of assumptions about the Sophists. What is the basis for those assumptions? Where are they? Maybe could you speak a little bit more about what those sorts of, well, you already mentioned the relativism, but what those assumptions are, and how did we get to the place where those were the standard assumptions that people were making who approached these individuals or this group?
Plato. And especially from the prosopographical perspective, that in a lot of dialogues, you have Socrates, but also people other than Socrates, as it were, giving a kind of shorthand list of important intellectual people, like Protagoras and Gorgias and Protagoras, or like, oh yeah, like Hippias, Prodicus, and Protagoras. And so you get this you get a kind of stereotyped list of celebrities, which from my perspective is never treated as some kind of exclusive list, or even as especially informative about the circumscription of Sophists. But these are like the really celebrated figures. They are representative types. And because the Platonic literature is so vivid, is in a sense so insistent on this point, and really becomes the best, or anyway, most continuous depiction of this late 5th century intellectual culture, more consistent in a way, or more continuous in a way than Aristophanes, for instance. I think that just became dominant. And then as Plato is mined in various ways in the imperial period, and then again in the Renaissance, as in a sense the primary source of information for this period, that set was just taken as definitive.
And on top of that, or with Plato's depiction of the Sophists as a particular group, comes his understanding of the way that the Sophists are sort of positioned within 5th century intellectual history, where they're nearly always opponents of Socrates in one way or another. And the reasons for Plato to do that are fairly obvious if you think that the Sophists and Socrates were all subject to suspicion for bringing novel intellectual ideas into Athens. To distinguish Socrates from the Sophists was an important project in Plato's rehabilitation of Socrates. But one of the consequences of that was to obscure what we argue, and other people throughout history have at times argued, are much more substantial continuities between Socrates and other figures in late 5th century intellectual culture, and a tendency to view the Sophists as quite a sort of separate idiosyncratic group, whereas our tendency has been to see them as really central to what's going on in late 5th century thought, and to try to sort of see their linkages with other areas of the culture.
Yeah, and to emphasize this point about this Platonic and to some extent Xenophontic presentation of Socrates, what's remarkable is even in light of the contrast, I mean, insofar as Socrates wins the conversations, is the continuity in type. The people he's talking to presumably are to be taken as like most his peers, most his intellectual equals, and they're very much sharers of discursive norms. I mean, they know how to do short answer stuff. They can give long questions. They are interested in virtue and justification and so on and so forth. And so if one is reading Plato's dialogues, not to find some kind of vitriol toward the Sophists, but instead to see Socrates basically, at the peak of intellectual, conversational, dialectical practice, then it makes sense that the people we now call the Sophists are really his confrères, the people who are actually, largely in the same social milieu of Nicias and Pericles and Damon and so forth. So he's just like, the best conversationalist in the room. And then maybe Plato also thinks that he has certain ideals that he's able to express that differ in some respects to the ideals of the Sophists, but that those differences, I think, are subtle and need to be argued for, and are not a matter of like mercenaries against like some pure austere, priestly type.
Well, presumably that's exactly why so many of the Platonic dialogues are about making that argument, right? That there's that about if there's a subtle difference, that's why you need to argue it at length. Presumably. Maybe we could go back to the beginning, though, and to return to something, I think that you were getting at. I suppose the question is, for you as editors of this volume, how are you understanding even the term Sophists? How is that a meaningful category? And this is something you get at in the volume, but could you maybe explain a little bit how you tease that group of people out from what we tend to just refer to as the Presocratics?
So one glib but not incorrect answer would be that the Sophists are whatever people have said they are. So that is, we are not necessarily interested in trying to isolate what the Sophists were most essentially, but rather we're interested in using the category which has developed over time, and seeing what it opens up in terms of affiliations between the people who we generally describe as Sophists and also other people who we might not generally describe as Sophists. So it begins with a sort of core group that we see referenced in Plato again and again, and then through Plato and Aristotle, that gets picked up into the history of philosophy. But we're also open to the idea, and indeed invite the possibility that aspects, the sort of salient aspects of those figures would be shared with other figures who were not generally considered Sophists. So we end up with a picture of the Sophists, which has the sort of conventional figures at its core, but which is open to the possibility that depending on the sort of question or the subject or the relevant quality, we could find that many other figures that were contemporary would be equally sophistic.
Yeah, and here's sort of a medium way around to describing the way in which the Sophists fit in with the other pre-Socratic philosophers. And that is, in the 5th century, though this could be spoken of a bit more precisely, it's as though the term sophistes or sophisti was like our term intellectual or intellectuals. And so it has a fairly relatively general meaning, although it is often not difficult to identify who is an intellectual and who is not. But it's important to see that, like in contemporary academia, you have some people who are academics who are clearly intellectuals, but you have many academics who are not intellectuals. I mean, you just wouldn't describe them that way. You know, I have a close friend who's a great soil scientist, but I don't think he would see himself as an intellectual, and other people wouldn't either. And so I think, though this is perhaps not precisely the same contrast, but at least in the kind of Aristotelian view of a pre-Socratic philosopher, a philosopher is a kind of scientist who's investigating things, trying to come to, reasoned explanation or full causal understanding of some phenomenon. And those people do not need, so to speak, to be intellectuals. They don't need to have a kind of public orientation. They don't need to be especially wide-ranging in the interest, so they may be. By contrast with Sophists, where there's a sense that there's a bit more public orientation, there's a bit more interest in abstracting from a range of lived practices or experiences and seeing what's connected, whether it be cartography or navigation or what have you. And that's the reason for saying, look, it doesn't quite make sense to say that the Sophists are a subcategory of the pre-Socratics, but it really doesn't make sense to say that they're somehow a contrast type. It's rather a kind of, it's a pair of overlapping descriptions of, knowledge workers of one sort or another in the 5th century.
Yeah, in the introduction, as you're establishing the term, as you're framing the term, you pose this question of what exactly is binding this group of people together, which, Josh, you've already answered in a way, that the fact that people have bound them together in the past, but that there have been attempts to see them as a group on the basis of philosophical affinities, relativism or skepticism, and or what you call sociological affinities. And it seems that their teachers maybe accepting fees, educating the elite youth of Athens. So I guess maybe, Christopher, to return to your point about academics versus intellectuals, which I think is an interesting comparison, to what extent is this a meaningful category on the basis of thought? And to what extent is it, I guess this is a classic sophistic, like, is it logos or is it ergon? Is it sort of what they're thinking, how they're thinking, or maybe also kind of what they're doing?
Well, what they're doing, but rather where they're doing it. That is to say, there is a kind of intellectual culture of which they are some of the, the talent, as you might imagine, or as you would think of it. If you think about, like, the Impressionist movement, do we say, like, you just have a certain kind of painter? Well, there's a way in which you have a certain kind of painter, but you also have a certain kind of museum base. You have a certain kind of public interested in seeing pictures. You have certain kinds of collectors and connoisseurs and so forth. So one point that we want to draw attention to, and this goes back to this kind of, not wanting to draw a sharp contrast, say, what are the Sophists? Well, the Sophists are an expression of something happening in Greece in the mid to late 5th century. And so, Josh has called this, they're a sort of phenomenon. That is, that they're kind of the public viewable tip of the iceberg of a kind of exchange of ideas, a kind of broadly diffuse theoria of thinking, of thoughts, or whatever, whatever is in the thinkery in Aristophanes' Clouds. And so what binds them together is there being the characteristic expressions of what we take to be this, somewhat novel cultural formation.
So the core that you mentioned in the introduction, because there was discussion or mention earlier of this core, there are 5 that you mentioned: the Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, Prodicus, and Antiphon. Josh, I know that this concept has been also a part of your previous work on this period, but could you maybe say a little bit more about their context, about the milieu, and about this rubric that you have for thinking about them, namely under this heading of the 5th century Enlightenment? Because they think that the historiography, would sort of see the entire Athenian intellectual landscape as changing when Gorgias arrives on an embassy in 427 or something. But you argue in your chapter for this broader basis and context. And could you maybe speak a little bit about that kind of moment? Going back to Christopher's example, if it's the Impressionism is a movement in Paris, what is subtending the whole thing, and how is it interacting, or how is it, embroiled in the rest of society?
So it's a great question. It's a really big one. I guess where I would start is to say that in the 5th century, we understand Athens as much a kind of meeting place, as a place that produces its own homegrown intellectuals. It does, though, produce homegrown intellectuals, and it attracts intellectuals from other places in Greece because of its wealth and power, and because of its famous and also highly self-conscious love of learning and the arts. There's that factor, that is the idea that Athenians are particularly sort of interested in displays of intelligence. Another factor is certainly the Athenian democracy, which would have made public speaking a particularly sort of important social value, with lots of people wanting to gain experience in public speaking, and public speaking as a form of sort of public reasoning and deliberation. And so we think of Athens as the place that sort of catalyzed a movement, a set of intellectual sort of tendencies, for almost somewhat contingent reasons, but that then generated quite a lot more interest and excitement, because it was the place where people came from throughout the Greek world to sort of demonstrate their ability to speak well, to give a great speech, to teach people how to speak well, to teach people how to reason well. So we focus very much on Athens as the core, even though the Sophists themselves, indeed the 4 canonical Platonic Sophists, which are all the people you mentioned minus Antiphon, the only Athenian in that group, the 4 canonical Platonic Sophists are all outsiders. It's something that we've noted a couple of times, that Plato's vision of the Sophists is largely a vision of people coming from outside. Antiphon is not referred to at all in Plato. He's referred to as a sophist only in Xenophon. And he seems to have quite a different sort of professional life, what we know of Antiphon. And there's also a question of whether we believe that Antiphon the sophist and Antiphon the orator are the same person.
I was just going to ask you. You think yes, right?
We are committed to the view that they are, and it's actually kind of significant, and it's actually maybe relevant to what we're talking about now, that we are where that comes from, which is the idea that the people that we call sophists and who would have produced texts that would have been interesting, provocative, radical new ideas, like we attribute to Antiphon the sophist, would also have been the people who would have been producing texts for learning how to give a speech, would also have been involved in the Athenian democracy as logographers and as political figures themselves. So we are committed to the view that those identities are compatible, which has led to, and it is questions about that compatibility that has led to people imagining that there were multiple antiphons.
Well, let me ask then, if we're trying to get at this group of people, at this movement, and maybe to the extent that's possible, peel away the accretions of, the Platonic presentation and the other. Christopher, I want to come to your chapter on the creative reception of the Sophists in the 4th century. What is our corpus? Like, what are we dealing with? What do we have? And maybe you could say a bit, just for people who are interested, how do we access these texts? What editions do we find them in?
Well, we have tons of material. And this is itself a kind of, well, it's not controversial, but it is a little bit new. So, for instance, the most important book on the Sophists heretofore, or let's say the most recent important book, was about 4 decades ago by Kerferd. And in the first page of his book, he says, we have no material from the Sophists. And that's a strange thing to say. It's also not true, because we have speeches of Gorgias, we have quite a lot of writing of antiphon across the genres. Pretty amazingly, that is forensic speeches for capital cases. We have these moot trials. We have quite a lot of excerpts from this book called On Concord, which I think may well be the first book of ethics, probably 4 or 5 pages from that discontinuously. So when it comes to figures like Protagoras and Hippias, it's true that we have mostly snippets, sentences here or there that have been quoted by later authors. And so that is unfortunate, but those snippets often give us a pretty good sense for both the range of interests, which we think is really quite important, that we don't just have teachers of democratic speech, for instance, but we have people engaged in cosmological reflection, historiographical reflection, and so forth. That we could say for the other figures as well. But then we have these 2 other very large corpora. One is 5th century material, so we might say Thucydides predominantly. That is, he is not, as it were, speaking directly about any of the Sophists we've mentioned, although he has characters who will refer to sophistic productions or to the kinds of interests that an audience of sophistic speakers would have. But he himself is an author whose thinking and whose writing cannot but be such an expression of that kind of characteristic debate that and in an exploration and so forth that Josh was mentioning before. The same goes for Herodotus and for Aristophanes and Euripides, just to name the most essential authors. So that's the second very large corpus, and then the third huge corpus is Plato, and to a lesser extent Xenophon. And we think that if we, as it were, de-psychologize Plato, not say like, oh, Plato hates the Sophists and he's so harsh on them and so forth, and say, look, he's also this very creative depictor of exchanges in the 5th century that go for a certain kind of sociocultural verisimilitude. While, of course, we need to be quite careful, we see that Plato, well, number one, was alive and cognizant during the lives of quite a number of the Sophists, but also would have been learning from and talking to all sorts of people who were very close to the Sophists. And so his presentations, again, if we don't take them wholly as tendentious, are sort of enormously informative, or at least suggestive about the kinds of interests people have.
And I'd add to that one of the things that Christopher got at is this trifurcation or diversity of evidence that we have for the Sophists, which makes the project of reconstruction quite challenging. That is, we have lots of evidence, but it's very hard to know exactly what all of it means. If you think about the way that Thucydides or Euripides might be evidence for the kinds of things that people are thinking about in the late 5th century versus the kind of evidence that Plato might give us about Hippias's views or his personality versus the direct evidence that would come from Gorgias's speeches or from, say, the Dissoi Logoi, a text which we don't have an attributed author for, but which seems to sort of reflect lots of ideas that are familiar among the Sophists. So there's a real challenge in reconstruction that this evidence presents, but there is a lot of evidence. And the challenge in reconstruction that it presents is not really so different from the challenge in reconstructing the views of Socrates, where we are quite familiar with triangulating between different forms of evidence and with a sort of relative paucity of first person or of directly transmitted writings, but a real abundance of secondary transmission or of reception, characterization, report on the figure.
And I would just add that back to this theme of sort of modern era historiography of the Sophists and the way that this sort of caste interference pattern. So I think one reason that, at least through the modern era, it was seen, or at least it seemed, that we didn't have very much material from the Sophists is because there was a pretty strict differentiation between oratory and philosophy, and then whatever this third category is. And so, for instance, the speeches of Gorgias, as well as I think of Alcidamas and Antisthenes, who might be thought of as more or less second generation Sophists, they were transmitted in the rhetorical manuscripts with other 4th century orators, and to a certain extent, scholars could have been aware of those works, but they didn't seem, I think, for some reason, pertinent to reconstructing this kind of intellectual, sort of quasi or more or less philosophical milieu. And then, furthermore, the materials of the Sophists that seemed too philosophical, and this is what Josh was mentioning with respect to the two antiphons, that too somehow didn't seem to be speaking to the Sophists, or was discounted as somehow a kind of goofy, like, jouissance of, this kind of playful Sophists who, like, they're just saying stuff to tweak the real thinkers. And so then, it didn't seem so much informative of their views as of their, prankster nature or something like that. And so it's trying to, like, diffuse those categories, those modern categories, that I think has helped us find that actually there's quite a lot of quite relevant, even if challenging to negotiate, information.
So, would one example of that be not really taking very seriously antiphons tetralogies and just sort of dismissing them as, someone being kind of annoying and, arguing back and forth on these same points just because, I don't know. For some reason, my sense was always that those, and again, there's then the bifurcation of antiphon that we've been talking about, that those just have not historically been taken as very sophisticated documents of thought.
Right. Or I'll just say, or as documents relevant to the history of Athenian law. I mean, if you look at, like, for many, many decades, the scholarly articles about antiphons tetralogies are the degree to which they seem not to match up with actual norms of litigation or the ways they are informative of that. So then it's taking just as, like, something relevant to an ancient historian, yes, or as just playful, rather than what seems quite evident from the last 15 years of scholarship, that some really fundamental distinctions and problems and puzzles in the nature of causality, in the nature of testimony, in the nature of, the connection between perception and report is found in there. And so, from this sort of latter day perspective, it seems like, wow, that's an amazing set of texts dealing with issues that we see in Gorgias's Helen, and we see, in a sense, even from the physicists' literature in Democritus and Empedocles and so forth. Like, really, what is it for there to be things causing other things? What is it for responsibility to be possible?
Yeah, and I guess I think, too, of how often, you see dismiss the ancient tradition that antiphon is teacher of Thucydides, but of course there's been so much, this is, now we have, I think, have a better intuition that this is clearly can be a kind of, metaphorical thing that, might be worthy of being taken seriously. But Josh, I was wondering, we've spoken a bit about Gorgias, who's such a crucial figure, and, your chapter really gives us this 5th century context. Could you speak a little bit about the Encomium of Helen and to some extent the defense of Palamedes? Just because I think that maybe people listening to this, the best likelihood of a direct contact that they'll have had with these figures might be through the Encomium. Could you just say a little bit about, what are these texts? What are we even looking at when because, we don't find them, they're obviously not tragedies and they're obviously, not law court speeches. So they kind of slip through the cracks a lot of the time. So what are we even dealing with when we look at these?
I wouldn't want to venture too much certainty on what we're looking at when we deal with them. They're what we call epitactic speeches. That is, they're speeches that were written and that we imagine would have been delivered as sort of displays of Gorgias's intellect, learning for entertainment, edification. But we know very little about what and how, in what medium they circulated, whether they circulated primarily as texts or as performance pieces. But what we can see from them is, a tremendous sort of investment in the mythological tradition, but a really exciting attempt to bring that tradition into the sort of reasoning norms of the 5th century, I would say, and to use mythological tradition to get at questions of human responsibility, to get at different modes of presenting an argument, to consider gender roles and the organization of society and assignment of responsibility or blame. And so one of the challenges in dealing with these texts has always been that they are, on some level, clearly not what they portend to be. Gorgias is not a defense lawyer for Helen, nor is Palamedes on trial in 5th century Athens. And so there's sort of a problem in understanding how seriously to take them, and which I think is true of much of Gorgias's writings. I mean, when someone writes a text arguing that nothing is, you do have to question how they mean it or what they mean by it. And so I guess I think I see these as, both displays of Gorgias's capacities as a speaker and a thinker, but also as provocations, as sort of dialectical moves that solicit further discussion and thought. And in that sense, I think I see them very much like construction of a Platonic dialogue, in which you would also have characters sort of arguing different sides of an issue. With Gorgias, we tend to just get one side, but it implies always the existence of another side by its sort of forensic or quasi-forensic context.
Can I jump in and say that there's another element that contributes to this picture of the sophistic movement that we've been talking about, and that is the Helen. It's sort of a synthesis of the speculative science of the day as well. And I want to point that out because I think Gorgias is typically thought of as an exponent of a very clever, even brilliant rhetorical program. But in the Helen, Gorgias is saying there's like 4 possible explanations for Helen having gone to Troy with Paris. And in any of those 4 cases, we don't need to hold her, or we shouldn't hold her responsible. And so through those 4 sort of quadrants, Gorgias has occasion to talk about what we might think of as where sort of the whole curriculum of philosophy. So in the last section, he's talking about the power of perception and the way that we see, and how the things we see are affecting our actions, as it were, unconsciously. In another section, he's talking about the power of speech, which is either connected to magical action at a distance, or like the subtle effluvia, some kind of atomistic, Democritean and Empedoclean approach. And then in the section on on persuasion. He's giving a kind of theory of either rational action or motivated action. And so if you step back and you see what are the individual moves that he's making, it's not just he's using modus ponens or modus tollens reasoning, which he is also doing, but he is, again, very much like the Platonic dialogues, he's basically absorbed this incredibly complex and diverse intellectual culture and has mobilized it in a quite sharp and fascinating way. I mean, the other thing I was going to mention is that this speech, along with the Palamedes and probably the original form of On Not Being, I think would take about 15 minutes to present. So it is a kind of presentation where you could imagine he gives it to an audience, whether it's a small audience of friends or a larger audience at the Olympic Games or something like that. And then conversation can ensue, either Q&A of him or people among one another. So as a kind of intellectual object that has great force and, as Josh said, great provocation, but also great a kind of a mirroring quality. That is, it like Aristophanes' Clouds or like the Platonic dialogues, it sort of shows to the audience a kind of complete view of this enlightenment. I mean, it's quite impressive in that respect.
They're like TED Talk length.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good.
What do you both make of this intellectual efflorescence taking place really right in the context of the Peloponnesian War?
I don't think there's a simple answer, in the sense that I don't think there's an obvious causality. I mean, I think that in one sense it takes place in this, both the Peloponnesian War and the Sophistic sort of moment are symptoms of a globalizing Greek culture, or globalizing a sort of more interconnected Greek world at that moment. They're also then casualties of, both at that moment produces casualties, both in, I think, the suspicion of the Sophists that we see in Athens, and of course in the war itself. I mean, I think of the Sophists as sort of enabled by the mobility that leads to the sort of tangled alliances that also are sort of behind the Peloponnesian War. We do not have, I think, very clear reflections from the Sophists on what was going on in the Athens of their time, but we don't have, we don't necessarily have enough information to say all that much. We do have records and some brief excerpts of speeches in favor of peace and concord, and the Sophists could at times sort of take on roles as speakers for a sort of pan-Hellenic or more Pacific idea of Greece. But I think that's, I think we'd have to to think about that. We need to answer it someone more specifically in terms of the individual Sophists and what we know of each one of them and their careers. Sorry, that wasn't a very satisfying answer.
No, but I guess I'm just wondering, thinking, maybe not thinking of the present moment, to what extent people in that era, there seems to be a climate ripe for thinking about causality, about, how did we get to this reality? How do we understand this reality that we're in? What is, if you think of the Sophistic archive, and also adjacently, classically Euripides' Helen or something, like what can actually be believed? How do we trust our perceptions or understand causes? And I guess then I'm thinking of Thucydides' proximity to all of this, and causation being so important for him.
Well, I think one of the things you're getting at, and one of the things that maybe gets back to the sort of historiographical questions, is that, what really distinguishes late 5th century philosophy from earlier 5th century philosophy does seem to be its real immersions in questions of the senses, of epistemology, of how we know what we know and what is true and false, and also in questions of sort of ethics and responsibility.
I agree with everything Josh says. And especially from the perspective that there's a way in which the Sophistic movement preceded the Peloponnesian War, though its frenetic quality is probably connected. It's probably quite related to the frenetic quality of geopolitics at the time. A couple other interesting things, though, is that we have these big-name people, Hippias, Protagoras, and so forth, who are circulating. Well, one reason they're circulating is because they are representatives of their cities, and whether they're officially diplomats or not, they are on often de facto diplomatic missions. Why are they sent? Well, maybe because they are, as it were, the most powerful speakers or deliberators. As their city has, they can serve in a kind of plenipotentiary status. So their circulation is already connected to the geopolitical diplomatic problems that are arising. Then they're in a city. They give their speech or they have their meetings. They can't just leave after 3 hours. And so they're put up with Callias or whomever. And you have a lot of people who, have lots of intellectual firepower or whatever it happens to be. And you might think that some of the sophistic happenings, so to speak, are caused in a way by that kind of motion. And then you think, well, are they going because they're trying to be teachers? Well, I'm not sure that that's the case, but they're around. There's some young people who have ambitions on their own to do something. They're told, hey, you should listen to this guy Hippias. But thinking from that diplomatic perspective, what kinds of things matter? Well, when it's when it's issues of alliance and justification for alliance or for war, then history matters, then economics matters, ethnographic kinds of issues matter. And so you could see that there's going to be a kind of pressure, let's say, to either develop or to express the kinds of knowledge that our celebrated sophists have. And then I suppose the second thing I wanted to add was that we can think that some of the specific problems that are arising during the war, questions of divination and omens connected to eclipses, comets, this kind of thing, well, those become high-stakes questions. They're no longer just, as it were, scientific questions of curiosity. And so in this kind of high-stakes situation, especially when Athens is having many battles in which they're losing, you can imagine that the debate becomes quite animated, and powerful ideas, I think, will be differentially preferred in that respect. And so one can go through a list of kinds of topics. You see this most easily in the speeches in Thucydides, questions of justice, questions of civic constitution, questions of sort of the psychological sentiment, those sorts of issues. And so we see, wow, those are the important themes of the Sophists that we know. And it's hard to disbelieve that there was close connections between, as it were, the political figures who are the statesmen giving these speeches and their friends, their foreign guests, who are specialists in formalizing those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like, if the empire is kind of a crucible for this, the war just really turns up the heat on it. Well, were there other major topics?
Johanna, just the one thing that, maybe has come out sufficiently already, but it's that we found, and this comes across in the thematic chapters especially, that there's not really some area where the Sophists are the specialists and the Presocratics are not, and the Presocratics are specialists and the Sophists are not. And so what I think has often been the case, not unreasonably, is the thought that the Sophists were concerned about human questions, they were concerned about ethics, they were maybe proto-social theorists, proto-historians or actual historians. I mean, and that all seems true, but it is, I think, just invalid to say, well, they were that to the exclusion or because they rejected cosmological reflection, astronomy, meteorology, what goes under the terms of metaphysics, like nature of being or the nature of change. There's just like very clear evidence, not even reconstructed, but just like very clear evidence for their interest in that, and vice versa. if you look at someone like Anaxagoras or Archelaus, who are hardcore Presocratics and not Sophists, their interests run to the natures of communities, to the nature of language, to rhetoric, and so forth. So this is just back at the issue that we don't want to see the Sophists as somehow cabined off or like doing something that's really particularly distinctive. And that has been for us the importance of saying the Sophists, or to talk about the Sophists is to talk about the Greek Enlightenment, to talk about what's going on in Athens, in the intellectual world before and during the Peloponnesian War, for instance, and that it's not a kind of reactionary movement against some philosophy or against aristocracy. It's part of what it is to be a culture that is testing out ideas, arguments, modes of speech, modes of knowing.
Well, functionally, does the distinction in some ways just seem to be that with the Sophists, now we're talking about geographical, a concentration in Athens?
I wouldn't say so, because I think that you have similar move of Aristotle's philosophers into Athens for essentially the same reason. Not all. I mean, we don't know that Democritus spent very much time in Athens, or ditto Empedocles. And that might have made some difference. But even when they're in Miletus, they weren't then the Sophists in Miletus because of that. It seems to me rather that, first of all, Archelaus and so forth could have been considered Sophists. They just didn't take that kind of bright role in Plato's dialogues, number one. But number two, I think it's the same. I mean, my subjective sensibility about this is that it's a contrast between someone we think of as a public intellectual now, a major journalist, a major figure at a university, and someone we think of as like an extremely good scientist or mathematician or writer who just doesn't have that kind of persona, but who is contributing to a discipline in a way such that a century later, if someone like Aristotle is telling the history of their discipline, physics, the nature of the four causes or whatever, they would point those people out, not as though the other people are somehow just popularizers, but it's more just like they're not as relevant to the particular story of the disciplinary innovations that he wants to cover.
Yeah, so it seems to be more of a sort of sociological category in our mind, and a sociological distinction between Sophists and other people within their intellectual culture that seems like the really relevant one.
So the Sophists are interested in outreach.
Yeah, and and that's obviously, but part of that is connected to the fact that there are some really important fora for that kind of outreach. And so Athens and the Sophists are sort of natural pairs, I think you're right to say, even if the Sophists are sort of a much wider phenomenon than Athens.
Well, going back to something you were saying, Josh, earlier about, the premium on public speaking that has arisen in the context of the democracy at this particular moment, wherein everything, to be a good rhetor is what everything is sort of hinging upon. Well, this has been great. Thanks so much. I think that it's really cool that this volume came out. And like I said, we've already used it I think I told you this in my Greek prose composition class.
Okay.
Did I tell you about this?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, we do like stylistic things. And we read the chapter on language, Bonazzis chapter
Great.
for that when we were reading the Encomium of Helen, or we were reading a part of it when we were doing conditionals, like if she came because of
Cool.
So it's already been useful, and it is, I saw that, there was that very favorable, really nice Bryn Mawr review of it that's saying that this is something like this has really been long overdue, and that this is certainly more than the sum of its parts. So I like to end these episodes with a little word association game, which I guess is maybe slightly sophistic in itself, so appropriate for the context. I will say a word, and then I've learned when I have pairs of guests that I have to call on someone randomly to go first, otherwise it's not fair. Because they get too long. The other person gets too long to think. So I'll say a word, and then I'll call on one of you to just give me the first thing that comes to mind, and then I'll ask the other one. First word, Josh, I'll ask you, what comes to mind if I say Protagoras?
Measure.
Christopher?
Antilogy.
Okay. Dissoi logoi. I'll go to Josh again.
Bad and good.
Relativism.
All right, Christopher, Encomium of Helen.
Cause.
Josh?
Aphrodite.
Christopher, the Sophists.
Intellectuals.
Josh?
Plato.
And the last one is sophistry. Josh?
Politics.
Ew. Mine is ew.
Christopher, yours is ew, or that's a reaction
Ew.
to Josh?
No, ew. That's my answer.
Ew isn't gross, not like ooh, great.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Yes. English ew.
Okay.
EWW.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Both of you, congratulations on the volume and its wonderful reception, and thank you for putting it together.
Sure.
Well, thanks, Johanna, and for inviting us. This was really fun.
Yeah, this was fun.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.